Bueno, buenas tardes. Creo que vamos a empezar con esta sesión.
Good afternoon. We're ready to begin our session on the electoral cycle in Latin America in the political arena. Here, in a year's time, we may see a map that's quite different from what we have today. So we thought it was important to have a discussion with eminent specialists, people from the countries, for them to tell us what they see in terms of the electoral situation and politics in general. We are going to talk, and of course we can't talk about all the elections. There are legislative elections in Argentina and Costa Rica, but we are going to be talking about the elections this year in Chile, and also next year in Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and in Venezuela, who knows? But I think that for Venezuela, it's important to think, and it's being said that there will be regional elections this year. That is yet to be defined, but I think that it is important to look at broader political scenarios in Venezuela, because this is an issue of interest to all of us. There is a great deal of uncertainty, and I can't think of any other juncture looking at the region, looking at the outlook. I can't think of another time where we were faced by so much uncertainty, with so many different countries that are facing electoral options for next year. We're going to talk about what the possibilities are in terms of the results. We're not going to get into any predictions. I don't think. I'm at least not going to force anyone to even take a guess at who will be the president in their country next. But I do think it's important to identify what the issues are, what the trends are in countries, things that you think will weigh on the election, things that will be important factors in determining who the next president will be or who will take the majority in Congresses. Now, of course, each country is different. Of course, there are elements in common, but it would be important to discuss the features that are shared across the region. So it would be good if we could talk about these substantive issues and looking at the entire region, and perhaps speculate about whether or not this is a time of political renewal in several countries. Obviously, there's a great deal of discontent with the status quo, with the traditional political parties, and they are looking at other options. And perhaps this is something that we should view as an opportunity for political renewal. Or should we expect greater fragmentation, more cynicism, more discontent? So basically, those are the questions. And I'm going to ask each of our speakers to tell us a bit about their thoughts about what is happening in their country, give us their analysis, and also try to put this in the broader context. All of our panel members are well-known, and also they are very good friends. So for me, it is a great personal pleasure to have such a high-level group of panelists, and I think that there is a lot of interest in terms of what may happen. If we begin, and let's go in order, and we'll talk about Venezuela towards the end because it's a different situation. But let's begin with the elections in Chile for this year. We're very happy to have with us Marta Lagos, who is the founding director of Latinobarómetro. We are all users of Latinobarómetro for our analysis, for our studies. This has been a great tool, a great input for all of us. And she has a regional vision, and I think that she could put the lessons from Chile in a regional context and tell us what to expect in Chile. There are elections in November, if I'm not mistaken, and if there's a second round, that would be in December. There is a lot of disenchantment with politics, according to surveys in Chile. There is a generational factor that was touched upon in the most recent panel with Fukuyama, talking about the experience of young people, a whole new generation. And also, we have seen President Bachelet followed by Piñera, and now Bachelet is back. And it seemed that there are great possibilities that Piñera may once again be elected. So, Marta, could you tell us what should we expect? What factors are the most relevant ones in terms of that election? And what can we expect in terms of changes with the new administration in March? This is an opportunity. Could there be major changes? What would you say about the situation, Marta? Thank you and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for your invitation to participate in this very interesting annual conference, where at least I have learned a great deal. So let's turn directly to Chile. In Latin America, and especially in Chile, there are two factors that determine what is happening in politics today. One is what the World Values Study tells us, and that is that there was a process where growth led to what is called by Engel a period of materialism. So there is a middle class formed. People gain consumer goods. Sometimes people become more consumers than citizens, and that is a very important phenomenon, because what it does is it separates the citizen from the collective. And if there's something that has been lost in the region, it's that concept of our being a collective. Now, we have forgotten that concept of the collective, reinforced by economic power. Everyone has a credit card, and the consumer feels empowered and distances himself from the idea that the state is useful. To this, we have to add corruption. And in the case of Chile, there were two factors. And the other factor is, what good does democracy do? In Chile, democracy began with a 90% participation rate in an obligatory system where 100% was registered in the participatory revolution of 1998. And then from 1998 to October 2016, in the municipal elections, that was down to 35% of the population that voted. There was a survey in Santiago last week saying that in this presidential election, only 30% of the voters would vote. That is 5 million out of 14 million voters. So that is the situation in Chile. That's where we stand. So you may ask us, what is the major weakness in Chile right now? That is the weakness. It is a tremendous representation crisis. There are 9 million Chileans who probably will not go to vote on the 19th of November. So who is electing the next president? We have 8 candidates, and we have this process where the belief that politicians are angels or devils. Society wants purism. That's what I call it, where they have taken the party system. It began with 5 parties, and now we have 23 different movements that we are tracking. So this segmentation began with the 2011 student revolution, and now we see that there are 2 lefts. One is the socialist left, and then the other left is what is called the broad front. They consider that they're all angels, and they want to distance themselves from the other left. So these are new parties with new leaders, and they have already been blamed for some scandal by the press, so they become devils too. Now, there's no one left in the political system in this competition that can be deemed an angel. If there's no angel left, then perhaps only 5 million Chileans may vote. So I think that that is the first point that we would have to take into account when looking at the elections in Chile. Then the other thing is the electoral competition. This morning, Engel, just a while ago, he is one of the promoters of all of the new laws against corruption, who has reformed the political system for the first time in 27 years with perverse consequences, because the only candidate that currently has state financing developed by, given by the state is a millionaire, Piñera. The other candidates have no funding. There's a problem with the law. There is a discrepancy, so neither private banks nor the Bank of the State provide credit that is backed by the state to the candidates for them to fund their campaigns. So there is a disparity in terms of access to electoral financing, and this is a result of an amendment of the laws. This is the first time it's being applied. We have a change in the electoral system. There are no longer just two parties. Everyone is competing against everyone else, and everybody is afraid to compete, because competing is telling someone else that they're bad. That's the way we're competing. And that is what has placed us in the midst of an elections where we have 8 candidates, where there are 4. A lot of people say that there are 3.5 candidates, actually, with coalitions that are, one is on the right, and all of the others are leftist. On the right is, if you take Christian democracy as part of the left, then that's divided into at least 6 candidates, and then a few that want to be in the political center. Now, the result of the distribution of votes is that if you add up all the left, and of course you'll come up with a higher number than the right. But the right is the only party that can present a joint position and will be able to collect enough votes to win. So Piñera had 5.3 million votes, and now apparently with the current predictions, the vote would be 2.5 million. So he is losing major ground compared to the last time. Now, a win, he may win the election, but it's hard to see that this is a major victory. He may even win in the first round. Now, yesterday there was mentioned in the press about discrepancy in terms of reports in the Congress. Right now, the Congress is telling prosecutors that they cannot investigate congressional reports. So the Parliament continues to sink itself. Now the trust rating is 10%. Political parties have a trust rating of 7%. So there's even a negative rating of the way that people see all political institutions. So parties are basically worthless. And when parties are worthless, people begin to vote for people. And when they vote for people, it's the caudillos that come out ahead. So we're going to have a parliament full of people and not of any party representatives. And how can you govern with a first parliament where there is competition amongst 1,000 some candidates? Now, political science tells us that more people should vote because we need more candidates. But so far, the forecasts say that in no case will this allow half of the population to vote. So We are faced with a population that, in addition to the individualism produced by economic growth and the consumerism of these citizens who feel empowered and they say, what good is the state to me? It gives me nothing. I have to work just as hard. So in that situation, we may wind up with a president in this country, a country that was a democracy, that was a true jewel in terms of electoral participation. We may have the same number of votes that we had before women were given the vote back in 1946. That was the last presidential election with no vote on the part of women. This morning I was talking to Hakim saying, look, I think we're actually losing ground in terms of political development. We have developed more laws. We have better control over corruption. We changed our electoral system, but we have a competition where not everybody has the same access to money. So that is a very great inequality in terms of free and fair elections. And we have a population that doesn't read the newspaper and that behaves electorally in keeping with their immediate surroundings. That's something that we talked about yesterday or this morning, saying that people vote based on their own experience. They're not voting following what the platform is or because of loyalty to a party. No. It's very hard to think of a democracy that has no parties. Well, we are very close to that, virtually, not institutionally, because the parties do exist, but people are no longer considering the parties in deciding to vote for a given candidate. So, as Mr. Fukuyama was saying, are we, after 35 years of the third wave, are we having a democratic system that has changed the way that democracy gets done? Because all I have heard in these 2 days is when we return or when we go back. I don't know. Can there be a coming back for this country or for England or for democracies that are evolving? What democracy is not evolving? Germany, perhaps. It continues to be what it used to be. But France, Holland, there are so many examples. Now, the case of Chile. Here I say, it would really be great. Today is the 6th anniversary of the death of Gabriel Valdez, father of our ambassador. So I was saying on Twitter today, wouldn't it be great if we could go back to those times? But it's illusionary to think that you can go back in time. How can we engage those young people that have never registered to vote? 4.5 million Chileans have never voted. So the challenge for politicians, and I think that now we're getting into a political era where we have to put the money, energy into developing a political system, just as we did with the economic system right from the beginning of the transition up to now. Now, who is going to win? Piñera in the first round, but he may lose the second round if there's a movement where everyone is against him. And if there is some miracle, the left may join together because they actually have more votes. So he may win in the first round, but lose in the second round. Those are two things that may happen. Or he may win in the traditional form in the second round. Thank you very much, Marta. This is a very good start. And now we're going to get to the more pessimistic cases. Because we just heard one optimistic case, but I don't know if this helps us reach our objective. I was thinking, should I talk about another country in Latin America? And then I decided I would talk about home. Okay, Dr. Rodrigo Pardo, who is editorial director of Semana, former foreign minister, one of the few friends from Colombia who isn't running for president. Unless you want to announce that you're running right now. If so, if you would like to make an announcement along those lines, please go ahead. So let's go to Colombia. You have elections for both president and Congress in May. Colombia, for 8 years now, has been under Álvaro Uribe. Before that, it was President Santos, and now the situation seems to be a very open one, a complex one. When 40 years ago I went to school in Colombia, the two parties were the liberals and the conservatives, and now they're almost indetectable in our surveys. This morning we had panels on economic matters and corruption, and of course these are issues in all countries. But in Colombia there is one additional issue, and that is the armed conflict and the peace process with the FARC that concluded last year. So my question to you is along those lines. Do you think that in the campaign, the overarching issue to determine who will be the next president of Colombia, in the campaign, do you think that everyone will focus on the peace process with the FARC? Because that has polarized the country. And also, it has motivated former President and now Senator Uribe to talk about this. Now, there is discontent, there is corruption. So what would you say? What do you think we can expect of the issues? What will be the most relevant issues? And of the 20-some candidates, if you don't want to give names, but what are the characteristics that people are looking for in a leader? What kind of leader are Colombians seeking? Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much for your invitation to this dialogue. I thank CAF and the OAS, and it's a pleasure to share this panel with such distinguished representatives. I'm going to begin with your second question, Michael, because I think that the 2018 electoral process in Colombia that has an election of Congress in March, and then in May and June, elections of the president. Along general lines, it's like elections in most of Latin America. In other words, it's taking place in an environment where policy is discredited. Marta, you said that parties have disappeared in Chile, but in Colombia, it's even more so the case. A lack of credibility. It's impossible to reach any sort of consensus. There's a lot of fragmentation. So it would seem that those are features that all of our countries share. And I think that the major question in Colombia, given the tradition that you were mentioning, Michael, for many, many years, we had a two-party system. That scenario of pessimism, of lack of satisfaction, polarization, is going to produce the classic pendulum from the forces that are in power now, in the government, and it's going to swing to the opposition forces. The discredit is such that it's also affecting the opposition. Instead of producing a pendular movement of the forces supporting the government to the forces in opposition, may actually become a phenomenon where there will be criticism of both the government and the opposition, and they may look to an outsider, to a third party. And in Colombia, this has been tested in the past without all that much success, because our two-party tradition has always carried the day. But I consider that in the current situation, given the depth of the insatisfaction and the climate of opinion, it's more possible than ever before. Maybe the opposition will not be able to channel the discontent felt vis-a-vis the government, which is high, amongst other things, because some of the reasons that affect the parties that are part of the government coalition also affect the opposition parties. And here what I'm doing is referring to the corruption scandals. The corruption scandals having to do with Odebrecht have involved the presidential campaigns of Juan Manuel Santos and also the Uribe candidature. And in other cases of corruption, there too, they have had to do with members of the opposition party, because some of the Conservative Party is opposition. So it is feasible that in the presidential election, the voters may seek different options. And that is so much so that there are some cases that are almost odd, and that is that the party candidates are preferring to run as independents, and they are actually distancing themselves from the parties. We saw Germán Vargas Lleras, who was vice president under Juan Manuel Santos, but he has a party where he is the natural leader, and he decides absolutely everything. And even he, who has his own party, says that he's running on his party ticket. No, he is running without representing a formal party. He has gathered 500,000 signatures of citizens to register and thus participate. So political parties are so discredited that out of the 20-some candidates or people who say they want to take part in this election, there are many more that are going to run based on the number of signatures collected. There are more people running based on signatures than on party allegiance. Now, there is a party, the UNAM, that is not the Uribe party, but a Santos Party. But originally, the U party was originally Uribe, will run no candidate. Some years ago, those who aspired to the president would fight over the party support. That is the only way to run. But now there's this new mechanism that was instituted as an exception. It's tortuous, it's lengthy, of gathering signatures to run on that basis. So that is what is happening in this election. It is a partyless election. It's an effort to deal with the pessimism and the lack of prestige. Now, in terms of answering the question for the panel, and that is, will this election be a renewal? Will it be strengthening of democracy, or is it political decay? And I would say that there are no clear mechanisms, accepted by the pre-candidates to decide how we're going to move from 25 candidates today down to 2 that are going to be part of the second round in June. Each pre-candidate has his or her own formula. So in the Liberal Party, and those who want an internal consultation in the party are looking for that. Those that have an open electoral concept, there is no way of establishing rules of the game. So we have a contradiction to the principle that democracy is the interplay of uncertain results and clear rules. Right now, rules are very unclear. No one knows who is going to name candidates, how they're going to be appointed, and what the winnowing out process will be if there is a second round, which is quite probable.
Especially when, at the same time as the candidates are launching their candidacies, we see every day new scandals that are erupting right and left. So the topic of corruption for this campaign will be more important than the topic of peace, for 2 reasons. First, because the scandals are there and they're very serious. The latest one has to do with 2 Supreme Justices who received bribes to change decisions related to politicians that have been indicted because they had regional agreements with armed groups. When the Supreme Court is being tainted by these scandals, these bribe scandals, this is an earthquake, really, and there is the credibility and the respectability is lost, and so this will figure more importantly for the campaign than the peace. Yes, the peace will be there, but not as importantly as in prior years, because as what we were saying during lunch, Colombian make a very frequent mistake, and it is to plan the next election the same way they planned the prior election. Some of the candidates think that the best way to reduce 20-some candidates to 2 is going by those who voted yes or no for the peace agreement. However, the situation is very different right now. There are not many decisions to make, and we already hear the candidates who voted no to say, well, no, we are not going, the fact that we voted no doesn't mean that we're going to go back on the agreement, or are we going to give the FARC their weapons again? Are we going to send them back to the rural areas and the mountains, wherever they came from? So that's not going to happen. So I think that regarding peace, paradoxically, the discourse will be more moderate, both on the side of those who voted yes as of those who voted no, and this will then make the peace topic less important, and will then bring to the fore the corruption issue as well as the economic matters. And the new president will find a totally different economic situation as confronted by both Uribe and Santos in the last 16 years. They will think to they will have to think of bringing the economy in stride with the rest of the world. And finally, regarding peace in Colombia, people wonder what will the role of FARC be. I think they won't be very significant during this election cycle. They said they won't be launching a presidential election. They will wait for the second round to see which candidate will be more in support of the peace process. But they may be thinking of running for office in some of the key towns where their influence is more known, and this will be in 2019. And so they are waiting their time. This is a time where leftist ideologies have lost their prestige, and now very much so in their association with Venezuela. The Colombian campaign looks like it were a campaign for the presidency in Venezuela, not Colombia, because the candidates are all talking a lot about Venezuela, and this weakens the leftist positions in Colombia. My last point will be institutional in kind. I cannot be optimistic. I think the parties are going to be losers in this process. We will have presidential elections without parties, but congressional elections that are firmly staying with their parties. So the parties are strong for Congress, but there are no independent candidates for Congress. So the Congress is still the one keeping the kind of traditional politics that people don't trust anymore. And then we have the presidents with no dominance by the traditional parties, and then the Congress elections dominated by parties. So again, corruption, Venezuela, and the economy will be more important issues than the peace. So maybe we will have an electoral process with a great deal of demagoguery. Thank you. Now let's go to Mexico to be a little more optimistic. It is a pleasure to have a dear friend who is an ITAM teacher. She's an author. She is a political scientist, Denise Dresser. Mexico will hold elections in July. There will be no second rounds. Everything will be defined in the first round. And if we take a look at the surveys and the numbers, the polls for President Peña Nieto, his approval rating is not very high. However, the PRI that ruled for 70 years and now back with Peña Nieto, they're trying to keep their position in these election cycle. They need to have a strategic approach. So first of all, do you think, despite the fact that the people are dissatisfied with this administration, do you think the PRI will continue to be the governing party, or will it be possible that for the first time, if it's not PAN or another one, or the party of López Obregón will be elected? And also beyond the economic issues, the violence, and then there is the relationship with Trump. If there is an election where there would be impact from the U.S., it would be in Mexico, or it could be. Do you think this could also play a role in the election? Thank you. Thank you, Michael. It is a pleasure to be here. What happened to Mexico? Well, if this panel had taken place about 2 to 3 years ago, we would have been still in the era of big applause, praise. Enrique Peña Nieto was the savior of Mexico. So how did we go from there to a process of regression, of institutional deterioration, with a president whose approval rating is only 9%? A president who started out with an ambitious agenda for reforms in energy, labor, education, telecommunications. So how did we get from there to here, where social and political repudiation toward the president is very high, and the likelihood of an anti-system candidate to win, López Obrador, is maybe closer than ever before. The loss of the reputation of Peña Nieto is connected to that leading thread, which is corruption. The turning point was Ayotzinapa, but in fact it's the White House, the fact that there was never a credible investigation. As opposed to other Latin American countries, Mexico doesn't have independent attorneys or prosecutors, so no high-class politician from the PRI has been penalized and punished, and there have been corruption scandals coming out involving Odebrecht or HCL. And if I had a word, and when history looks back on Peña Nieto to define his administration, it will be the word corruption and impunity. And this is what is clearly the distinguishing feature for Mexico right now. For Mexico, it is impunity, and it has to do with the buddy system that formed a judiciary scaffolding to protect one another. Who's the beneficiary of this at this point in time? The situation in Mexico is volatile and fluid, and it is hard to make any predictions, but Manuel López López Obrador has been the best one to capitalize on that dissatisfaction, the anti-system feeling, the anti-party impetus. Only 4% of the population believes in parties only, and only 10% of the population believes that legislators legislate in their favor. And if we add the arrival of Trump and the way in which he is hitting Mexico on a daily basis, so someone with a nationalistic, populistic agenda appears as the only one who can be against those who want to destroy and this López Obrador is the candidate that can work. Back in 2006, wanted to destroy institutions, and instead of re-engineering institutions, given the demands of democracy, they allowed deterioration to continue, continuing many of the exclusionary practices of PRI, and López Obrador is capitalizing on the fact that reforms have been beneficial, but beneficial for the good old boys, the winners. The winner club were always only the winners who continue to win. The buddy system related to Peña Nieto, there are many bids related to the telecommunication reform, the economic oligarchs. So instead of being vaccinated through renovation of the democratic institutions, they have opted for PRI vision to learn that maybe they have only 6 more years left, so they want to extract as much as possible and continue to perpetuate corruption. It doesn't, but López Obrador does not necessarily get to be the president. He started with 30 points of advantage, but he made so many mistakes. He called it that there was a collusion against him, but I think it was an own goal. He had no agenda for the middle class. He was antagonizing the business groups, but now López Obrador is in his version 3.0. He is trying to contain his worst impulses. He's trying not to fight with businessmen. He's trying to offer an amnesty in those who want to participate in his loving republic, and he then will bless if they come join his coalition. He is anti-NAFTA, anti-reforms, anti-globalism. But if you were to ask me, in case he won, does this mean that Mexico would be Venezuela redux? No, I'm not concerned about his populism. I'm concerned about López Obrador's ignorance, and ignorance which was clearly demonstrated in the session. Here, where specific questions were asked him as to what to do with the special prosecutor for crimes against freedom of expression and that, and he avoids. He's not an expert in public policy. Yesterday, during a meeting we had as part of this conference, an American journalist asked him, in the case of Trump, and it is the same with Mexico, it's not the what but the who. So it doesn't matter what he proposes or if he breaks his promises, and including PRI people in his coalition, and including others whom he called the power mafia, because he feels that his base loves him, and he will take his anger against dysfunctionality and institutions to a different government. So, yeah, he's winning, but less than 30% of political support, with less than 30% support. He is a candidate with the highest number of vote intention, but also the one with the highest disapproval rate. So elections in Mexico will be a referendum on López Obrador, yes, or López Obrador, no. So what could happen? I don't think we can say that the PRI is done and over with. PRI won in Mexico State, and also using a method they will implement in 2018, which is a mix of spending, and more spending. What is the explanation behind the irresponsibility at a macroeconomic level for the PRI, their fiscal lack of discipline? There is the funds are being moved to other things and used for other purposes, and then use someone like, for example, the former finance minister Felipe Calderón and Arturo Nuño, the education secretary at present, one of these young men who don't stink as much and who are relatively decent and take advantage of the third ingredient of the PRI formula to maintain power, which is the weakness of electoral institutions and the lack of checks and balances. Because I think the worst thing in the 6-year term of Peña Nieto hasn't been corruption, but the weakening of the checks and balances, which we took a long time to establish freedom of expression, critical media. We've seen a reduction in the autonomy of agencies that could be checks and balances, that could be auditing, oversight, and so we see that the PRI could do what they did in the state of Mexico, which was violate the ceilings for campaign contributions, lie. And however, they won the election. So the model for the state of Mexico, which is also the model for Veracruz, that was created by governors who are in jail today, using shell operations, shell corporations to process their money, etc. But now we have López Obrador with less than 30% of people saying they're going to vote for him, and division because it's Margarita Zavala, the good wife, as Alicia Florek from the TV show, who decides to support her husband despite of all the things done during the presidency, and then she becomes co-conspirator in Calderón's mistakes. And therefore many think that her candidacy is like a facsimile of her husband's, and there is no possibility of having another PAN candidate that can agglutinate all the forces around their party. So we see a situation where we have the remaining left and the social democratic movement, the DRD, and a very and a left that is riddled with scandals of corruption, and these are ways of preventing López Obrador coming to the presidency. It is a broad front that will last until the candidacy separates them. They will have to come to a point where they can have a candidate that is acceptable for those who remain, both on the right and the left. But my most important message here is that regardless of who wins, and even though Manuel López Obrador may win, we are not going to see a debacle. But if there is no renewal of institutions, we will see more of the same. Another 6 years that will be lost for Mexico. What do I mean by institutional renewal? The signs of hope that are more encouraging in recent years in Mexico don't come from the political class, but from civil society. They are related to the encouragement to force Mexican politicians to present their income tax returns, their conflict of interest statement, and their property statements to have a general prosecutor's office that works, because so far it hasn't worked, because they bend to the president's desires to have a judiciary that is independent and autonomous. This comes from groups from the civil society that have presented a transforming agenda, but there are no politicians that are following a suit. So there is a division between the politicians, the parties, and the society that is tired, that is demanding on the one hand, and which coexists with a society that is willing to sell their vote because they have nothing to lose. I think this is the diagnosis for Mexico at this point in time, but it is changing, it is volatile, and it will depend on what López Obrador does or not, from the candidate launched by the PRI and the ability of the civil society to work in favor of a democratic agenda. Okay, now Brazil, everything happy? Everything wonderful? João Augusto de Castro Neves is director of Latin America Eurasia Group. There will be elections in October, a few months after Mexico, and the situation is complicated. You've been following this. This is a country where we've had the big investigation on the Lava Jato scandal that has affected even other countries in the region. The economy is better, but not as strong. The president has a very low approval and support, and the population who's looking for leadership right now. And I think former President Lula is still the leader in the polls, if I understand correctly, but he's also facing challenges, serious challenges at this point in time. Of course, there is dissatisfaction with the political class, but we don't seem to see any or very many attractive choices. So what can you tell us? What is your opinion of the elections? Maybe there will be an anti-system candidate. Do you think a candidate like that would succeed? And you can speak in any language.
Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be speaking English because I think that I'm easier to understand in English than in Portuñol. So, plus, you talk a lot of English.
The great merit, I think that when you look at Brazil, or I wouldn't say merit, but the great surprise that Brazil has brought to the discussion of Latin American politics over the last few years is that Odebrecht did to the region, or attempted to try to do through the region, what Bolívar didn't do in terms of integration, right? But unfortunately uniting the region through corruption, ties of corruption, rather than ties of integration. And so Brazil is kind of the original point of where this corruption scandal started. I think it's obvious to say that next year's election in 2018 will also be driven predominantly by the corruption, by the theme, by the topic of corruption. in Brazil. So this is to say that when we look in Latin America frequently, and in Brazil in particular, we tend to try to, and this was spoken here to some extent, pendulums, policy and political pendulums. Latin America going from the left to the right, from the neoliberal 1990s of the Washington Consensus to the Bolivarian 2000s in some countries, and then back to a haphazard kind of adjustment to the right again in some of these countries, with Mexico maybe being the exception next year, but then possibly. And I think that in Brazil, when you look at next year's election in 2018, it will be much less about left versus right. I think we like to, of course, it's easier to cast the world, the political divide in those terms. It's simple, you understand that. But in Brazil, I think the main driver for next year's election will be, rather than the left versus right divide, it's going to be much more about old versus new, meaning old by the traditional political class, the establishment, and new being these new forces, these surprises, some say anti-political or anti-establishment coming from the outside. And we're seeing, at least when it comes to the demand for that coming from society, that's clear. And that began actually in Brazil in 2013, when we had a wave of protests that rocked many Brazilian cities. And you have, in Brazil, when you have people in the streets and there's no music or no soccer, it is usually a sign of a problem. And since then, in 2013, approval ratings of leaders across the board, not only the president, but also governors and mayors, have been rock bottom. And I think that in some way or another has been also the reality in other Latin American countries as well, with the discredit, the growing discredit of the political class. So the demand for change is there. And I think that if you look at what does this mean for the election and who will do well, who will perform well in the election, I think we'll have to someone a candidate that combines two key features. One, the obvious one, the anti-corruption credentials, right? Someone that first is not corrupt, which is quite a challenge in Brazilian politics this day. I think in a way, election may be seen as a game of last candidate standing, right? Whoever is hit by Lava Jato is out of the race. And so we begin with 20 or so, and then, you know, the last that survives is the president, which is not an exaggeration. If you look at the number of politicians, Brazil, almost half of Brazil's Congress is under investigation, either for Lava Jato or for other types of illegal activities. So the corruption in Brazil has metastasized to a point that it is, you know, the dominant feature of Brazilian politics today. The second feature, and this is an interesting one, is if someone that basically promises to deliver better public services. And this is interesting because it's not necessarily left or right. People, and there are a lot of recent surveys in Brazil done, including by the PT, by the Workers' Party in Brazil, with their former supporters, that their supporters do not care, or care much less today than before, whether that service comes from the state, which is the cornerstone of left-wing policy politics in Brazil, or whether it comes from the market. They don't care. They want better public services. Doesn't matter the color of the cat, as long as it catches the mouse. And so someone that promised that kind of efficiency, because I think it's interesting to compare that discontent in Brazil and in other Latin American countries, that middle class discontent with the political class is there. And I think that's a common denominator to what we've been seeing to some extent here in the US or in Europe with the discontent towards the political class. The difference is that here and in Europe, it tends to be a discontent with a middle class that has seen itself as kind of with its standard of living being in decline. So this translates into a fear of competition with the outside, to protectionism, nationalism, populism, xenophobia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, these examples, plenty of examples around close by. In Brazil, and I'm not sure, but probably in other countries in the region as well, it's a middle class that wasn't declining. Actually, it's a middle class that rose until recently. In Brazil, middle class became, for the first time in history, more than half of the population. That happened in Chile, that happened in Colombia, that happened in other countries as well until a few years ago. So of course, they demand much more from their governments in terms of quality of public services. So this is precisely the case of Brazil, where tax burden is enormous. Some say Scandinavian levels, but the quality of public services is way, way, way worse. So this is a huge demand that the population has for someone who delivers. So those are the two key features that the population is demanding. Anti-corruption credentials and someone who delivers. So the problem is not of demand, of what the population wants. The problem is of supply, what the political system has to offer in terms of candidates. And here, there's a good news and bad news when it comes to Brazil. Or maybe bad news and worse news, I don't know, depending on how you look at it. I think that, you do have, Brazil's political system restricts competition. It makes very difficult for complete outsiders to make a competitive bid for the presidency. And the reason for this is that Brazil is a continental country. Presidential campaigns are quite expensive. You need the war chest from a big political party. In order to run, you need in Brazil's electoral legislation, you have TV time, broadcast time, that it's in accordance with the size of the party in the lower house of Congress. So of course, it's quite important, even though today with internet, social media, that you can bypass this kind of, TV rules, etc., it's still quite important to have that kind of political support there. So that's one. Some could see this as good news, that you limit the possibility of complete outsiders, but others could see this as bad news because look what we got, right, within these parties. And the parties are still important because you cannot have independent candidacies in Brazil. Right? I think that we've seen a discredit of the political class. We've seen the weakening of a lot of parties around the world. In Brazil, though, no, parties are still the important vehicle to do politics. It's easier to create a party in Brazil than it is to open a business in Brazil, right? And that's actually true. And politicians, they create parties in Brazil because when they create a party, they receive public funds automatically. So that it's a business, basically. So under the radar, this week, there's some legislation being approved in Congress that actually will create a performance threshold for parties that tend to limit the amount of parties in Brazil Congress. And that's phenomenal if it passes, and I think it will, which will reduce. Brazil's Congress today has 30 plus parties. And this is one of the reasons that makes it difficult for any president in Brazil to govern. The good news is that the president in Brazil, if that person wants to build a majority, that person will build a majority. Good news. The problem is that the cost of maintaining that majority together is increasing. Thus the incentives for corruption, promises to fund campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an important feature. So the issue is of then supply of these candidates. So I think any kind of political innovation that we'll see in Brazil next year in terms of new faces that represent this demand for change will tend to come from the well-known established parties. One example of this happened last year in the city of São Paulo and the mayoral election for mayor of São Paulo. A traditional party like the PSDB, Social Democratic Party, launching a businessman turned politician, João to become mayor of São Paulo. So this is the first time in history that the election in São Paulo was decided in the first round. So of course this is a recipe potentially for success for other parties to follow. Major parties trying to tap into that discontent by launching new faces, and not saying only Doria, for instance, from the PSDB, but also there are other names like former that have to combine those two features that I mentioned: anti-corruption credentials with the ability to seem to deliver, to be an efficient manager, to deliver better public services. Former judges like Joaquim Barbosa, former Supreme Court Justice of Brazil, Marina Silva is also potentially a new name. And we put out a piece of research a few days ago that got some traction in Brazil. Because we called Geraldo Alckmin, the well-known governor of São Paulo, as Brazil's Hillary Clinton. And he didn't like that. But this is not to say that he can't win. This is to say that he does have those credentials that make him a good candidate, or in previous elections. He's an experienced candidate. He's a governor of an important state, in São Paulo. But going forward, and in Brazil, this applies to Brazil, this applies to the United States, this applies to many other countries, those credentials are not enough. You need something else. So he may become Hillary Clinton in the sense that he's a well-prepared candidate that he may lose, because he doesn't attend to those demands of the population. So much, of course, will depend on the kind of candidates that we'll have next year. We don't think Lula will run for legal reasons. It makes sense for him to say that he will, because if we do a counterfactual exercise right here, right now, and if he were to say today that he's not going to run, he loses his political power today. So to say that he'll run makes sense, because that's his legal defense strategy. And he's much less competitive than it seems if he does run, given all the corruption scandals that he's been accused of as well. So it's going to be, so a lot will depend on the candidates that we'll have, but ultimately whoever wins will have to be from one of the mainstream parties, which tends to moderate a bit the levels of any kind of extreme policies, left or right, because the winner can come from the left or the right, because I said that this is not going to be, it's going to be less about left and right and much more about old versus new. And the good news about Brazil, I think, is that whoever wins, we tend to look at Brazil has a lot of checks and balances, right? A multitude of parties in Congress. Reforms take forever to be implemented. I mean, Brazil was a latecomer to the Washington Consensus in the 1990s, and still kind of implemented the reforms very slowly. But those same factors also prevented Brazil from going the other direction as intensively as Argentina or some of our neighbors went as well. Was the Dilma Rousseff government bad in a policy perspective? Yes, it was, but it could have been worse, right? If she didn't have her coalition that was to the right of her. So that will apply. I think that will also be something that whoever wins next year's election will have to deal. It will tend to moderate any kind of policy swings that we'll see. And just to conclude, I think that a lot has been said here about, will this be a wave of renewal in Latin America or in Brazil, the elections? I think that the deeper question here, and I think maybe it was discussed before, is that, I'm quite skeptical to see the election as a solution to these problems, right? For two reasons. One, I think that the society is quite polarized in Brazil. So whoever wins, I think that, if Lula were to win or anyone else, there'll still be, the population still be divided. So it's something to be asked about whether this has to do with, is it a generational change? Is it a technological change with social media? I mean, you have a generation of people under 30 that grew up with basically pressing a button, you solve your problems, right? You watch anything that you want to watch, you order anything that you want to order, you do everything with pressing a button. I think the question is valid whether that same technology is disrupting politics, is disrupting democracy, because expectations are much faster. You think that by choosing someone, that person will solve all your problems immediately. And that's not what's happening. So we've seen this kind of volatility of opinion poll, of public opinion, of approval ratings of leaders around the world. So that's something to be said. And finally, despite of all the crises that we've been seeing in Brazil, and we'll continue to see when it comes to the corruption, expect more headlines. There are a number of important reforms being approved, in microeconomic reforms and macroeconomic reforms, and I think these will continue. Temer, his approval ratings are lower than Brazil's interest rates. And that is not to say much. Well, Brazil has had record high interest rates, but interest rates in Brazil now are at single digits, and his approval ratings are still below. But that does not translate into low political capital, because this is not his agenda. This is an agenda of a country that has no other way to move forward. Because a lot of these reforms actually began, the inflection point was in 2015 with Rousseff, when she appointed Joaquim Levy as the finance minister, who started to kind of implement some of these reforms, and also in the energy sector as well. So I think that the pendulum whoever wins, will still move away a little bit from the left in a way, whoever wins in terms of the reforms next year. So I'll conclude that.
Great.
My thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you, João. That was great. Finalmente, Dr.
Then we have Luis Vicente León, our friend from Venezuela, who is president of Datanalásis. And in the case of Venezuela, perhaps the case is a bit different from what's happening in other countries. But there are other things that may be quite similar, too, in the regional context. There are elections, but those elections aren't all that clear or well-defined. It could be next month or at another point. Regional face-to-face meetings, we don't know. Next year, maybe, but there's a lot of uncertainty, obviously. I think that for this audience, I don't need to describe the situation in Venezuela. We all know that it's a very complicated, serious one, and reason for great concern. Now, the question that we always ask is, how can Venezuela put this crisis behind it politically? The situation has deteriorated. The economy is worse than ever. Do you think that this is a factor that may produce some sort of political response to pull the country through the crisis? What are the potential scenarios? What would you say in this regard? Well, first of all, thank you very much for your invitation. When I went to Caracas, I was trying to go back to Caracas, but the hurricane was coming, and I have to go through Miami. But when I do get home, I'll have a lot to tell my wife. She is a radical member of the opposition. I'll tell her that in Chile, people don't want to vote either, or that in Mexico, the president is less popular than Maduro. No one will believe me. Or a country like Brazil, where it would seem that the elections are not the solution. But the best thing is that there is a country like Rodrigo's where he talks about Venezuela and the elections, and that doesn't happen in my country. So I'll have a lot of news to share. I'll have a lot of news to share once I get home. Now, when we organize the possibilities of solving the critical problem of Venezuela, I would say that I would focus on looking at two key variables. The first is, what is the cost of Venezuela's government staying in power without elections by deepening their control over power, a complete concentration of power, repression, loss of freedoms, and standing against open, transparent political processes. What is the cost of maintaining that regime? And then second, what is the cost of getting rid of that government? How much would it cost the president to lose the election, to lose? How much would it cost them to not be in the power? Or say that he's removed by force. So the exit price and the cost of doing what they're doing. Those are the two variables, key variables, to understand what may happen in the future. Now, the opposition, society has been trying to work with Maduro this year, although they have been trying to do this for several years, to increase the cost of what the government is doing as much as possible. So that is what the whole social movements are about, the people in the streets, the marches. It's opposition saying, look, we're the majority. That's obvious. That is super clear. Not even the government is saying that it is a majority. It is clear that it's a minority government and that most of the people in Venezuela want change, and that basically this would be through an electoral process, which is the way that we know how to effect change. So change is being sought in Venezuela. That is clear. But then the opposition that has been protesting by saying we're the majority that is willing to defend its rights was trying to increase the cost for the government and its opposition to the electoral process. It should have happened in November of last year. There wasn't the referendum held. There were many different processes that did not take place in Venezuela. Then another thing is international support. That, too, was covered by opposition. The opposition wants the rest of the world to realize how essential it is to pressure for change in Venezuela, to understand the need to defend rights, transparency, democracy. So there, I would say that the population has grown. They have tried to turn the international community into allies in seeking this change. So I would say that the population has been very active, going to the streets, participating, and the world now realizes that the government of Venezuela has done a lot of things that are tremendously complex and that are all against democracy. Now, there has been a shift away from what we could consider to be competitive authoritarianism to a non-competitive authoritarianism, and that now the danger is to wind up in a process of totalitarianism. So that is very clear in the international debate. So when you look at this, you would say, okay, so the opposition has been successful in terms of increasing the cost of the government to do what it's doing. But what happened? There are two important things that happened. One, while all of this was happening, nothing was done on the other hand, and that was, how do you solve the problem of the exit cost? The exit cost of the government in Venezuela is infinite right now. If the government in Venezuela were to go to elections and lose, the government would feel completely destroyed, persecuted, and fenced in, with their money frozen, and with a population that could even turn on them physically. So just imagine if they are in power and can control everything. If they can't go to Miami to go out to dinner or to New York, just imagine if they're removed from power, they will feel that they will be destroyed. So you wind up with some kamikazes that are going to be willing to do whatever to stay in power. And do whatever is whatever, because the alternative isn't to change the government like in a democracy that exists in your countries. The alternative is destroying them. They're going to feel that someone's out to get them, and they will do everything to protect themselves. So if you turn to what they were initially after, this has become a matter of personal defense, and this complicates the solution to the problem, especially an electoral solution, because it would seem that elections could be a way out, but it isn't if the exit cost is infinite. So we have a country where the solution, where the change is focusing on two options. One option, which is a political negotiation coming out of a collapse or great pressure, but also a negotiation reducing the exit cost, or a coup, a major event that would remove the government by force. So here you're talking about two elements that are very complex. People may think that they're very straightforward, but the possibilities of occurrence are difficult. This is all very complex. So when you look at the exit cost, that exit cost is now infinite, and the only thing is that it will grow. There are no possibilities for negotiation right now because there's no bargaining going on. So the government party doesn't feel that it needs this because it won the round of opposition protests. But the opposition doesn't have bargaining power to go to the bargaining table, because it's not whether or not it's good or bad to establish a dialogue or negotiate. I think that establishing a dialogue, negotiating is always a good thing. But in order to negotiate, you have to have bargaining power. And if the opposition sits down now at the bargaining table, it has no negotiation power to seek its objectives. So they have to build up their negotiation power to make those negotiations make sense. The government doesn't feel that it has to negotiate because it doesn't feel that it's at danger. At least there's no imminent danger. So this is a process where post-protest, the opposition has fragmented and people feel frustrated, feeling that everything has come to an end. But that's not true, because the opposition can't win after one round. You cannot just go home after losing the first battle of the war. These are things that have to be constant, that have to be ongoing. But if you think that you were going to win, that there was no way to lose, and if you lost, everything was lost, then you lose your will to fight after one battle. And that makes the work for the opposition even more difficult. And if we look at the equation of the cost of the government continuing to do what it's doing, that cost has gone down because the protests are no longer there. The marchers went home. So it's hard for the opposition to tell people to go back to the streets to try again. People feel frustrated, not only frustrated, but also deceived, not only by Maduro. They punish him in terms of his popularity rating. The most recent survey shows us a president that is down 5 percentage points more after all these events. The popularity rating is close to 12.7%, even though ahead of Peña Nieto, so it has 12.8% of popularity, but also is down between 14 and 20 percentage points, because people feel frustrated with what has happened. And the most important thing is that this isn't a frustration only due to one event. When you go to a focus group, the conventional member of the opposition in Venezuela is going to say, he said that he could beat Chavez, that he was the majority, and he lost. And then he told me that he could beat Maduro, and he lost. And then he said that there was no way to avoid the referendum. And then he said that he would sit down at a table to have a dialogue, and that he would leave that table with a solution. And not only did he not accomplish those objectives, but he has backed off. And then he said we would take to the streets to get rid of Maduro Miraflores. So people are frustrated. Not only did this person not solve the problems, but they have become a liar, because they knew in advance that they wouldn't be successful. So there is slippage again in terms of the cost of letting Maduro continue to do what he's doing. But there's a second problem, too, and that is the threshold of well-being, to respond to your question. That threshold has to do with the impact of the destroyed economy. The economy has been destroyed. Venezuela's economy, when people ask me, when is the economy going to collapse? And the economy is completely collapsed. It's not that we're waiting for it to collapse. It already collapsed. And that collapse cannot be translated into a trigger of change. Because when they say, okay, we're ready, the economy is in shambles. No one likes Maduro. The economy has been destroyed. There are no products. There are scarcities of food, of medication. And if we add to that the unilateral sanctions of the United States, the only thing left would be minutes of Maduro, because that's something no government can withstand. But for Maduro, there's a terrible economic crisis, but we have another country, and that country is no longer looking for education, infrastructure, or travel, or houses. People are focusing on food. So the level of welfare dropped tremendously. So the money that you need to keep that population on your side is no longer $50,000 or $60 million that you needed 5 years ago, because now, with very few dollars, you can buy the population. All the people want is something to eat or medicine. So the threshold has shifted, and if you establish unilateral sanctions like those of the United States, and this isn't a criticism, I'm just analyzing the potential impact. What is the impact? The impact is that the economy will be even worse. It's already been destroyed. The only thing that you added to that is someone to blame. So Trump now shares the blame with a problem that already existed, or the impossibility of going to Wall Street to get money. And that well is dry. So you say that I can't borrow? I haven't been able to borrow for a long time. Or that the economy is going to be destroyed? It already is destroyed. Because Trump now is a player who adds value to the debate and to the Chavismo's argument vis-a-vis the population. But when you establish sanctions, what do you wind up with? A country like Venezuela that is looking for different support, different allies. And who have they been able to find? Russia, UNEF, financing, putting money into the country, and they see the possibility of getting concessions, oil wells, assets, and then China, that a couple of years ago would have said, you know what? I don't want to lend you any more money because you've been irresponsible. But now China's saying, okay, I'm not going to lend to my irresponsible brother-in-law because he's irresponsible. But if my nephew is in intensive care, I'll pay the bill. And the pressure when China comes into this game, it is buying up Venezuela bonds or recycling credit. So what is happening? The country is poor, yes. And in this super poor country where the government, the people are poor, that is the reality. And the people are poorer than the government. And the only way of finding resources is going to be him and not me. So it's not Maduro being affected by the sanctions. I'm being affected. It's the business community. It's people that are being affected. So with the best possible intentions, this whole matter is going to become a headache, even internally. I conclude talking about where we're headed. We're going to have elections? Yes, I think we will. So the question is no longer if we're going to have elections. The question is, will we have competitive elections? And there the answer is no. No in Venezuela until you solve the problem of that exit cost and the cost of the government staying in power. Until that is solved, there cannot be competitive elections. There may be elections. There may be some elections. There can be many governors in the opposition in the next regional election, because that will be good for the government, allowing it to say, look, they're saying I'm a dictator, but look, there are 15 or 20 or 10 governors that are running against me. But they're not going to have money, they're not going to have power, nor will they be able to do absolutely anything. And they'll probably all wind up in jail over the next 2 or 3 years, because the Constituent Assembly is Chavista. So this will become even more complicated in the elections for president. So that is just one thought that I think is very important. While all of that is happening, I understand that the international community is concerned, and we appreciate your worry. Thank you for trying to help. But helping does not mean taking actions to overthrow or remove Maduro. The most important thing now is to take the actions that are necessary to increase the bargaining power of the opposition so as to allow it to go through negotiations leading to elections and a stable situation in the long term. Otherwise, all of this will turn into an internal war or a civil war and a very unstable situation in the medium term.
Thank you for finishing on time.
No answers, but questions. At least we can get questions, even if we can't get answers. We'll have to make it very, very brief because we're running a little bit over time, but this has been 5 terrific presentations.
Rafael Castillo, Venezuela American Leadership Council, this side, over here. Here, Michael.
Huh?
Hi.
Okay.
La pregunta para Vicente León.
My question, I have a question. What sanctions will affect the people? Well, the biggest one was the 18-year dictatorship of Maduro and Hugo Chavez. And second, how can you reduce the exit cost of a government that all it does is to increase inflation and abuses of human rights? We're going to forgive them when they leave? What do you, Mr. León, propose? Here, Gabriel Hugo from Venezuela. Rafael took away part of my question, but I greatly respect Luis Vicente, and I have to ask something somewhat against what was just said. As Venezuela, I've been here for a week, and one sanction for me, which is taking away my passport. The Venezuelan people are punished by a dictatorship that doesn't allow us to eat or have hospitals or even have basic rights of a human being. And I think that the problem is there. So in this, I'd like to ask a question. We have been continuously doing the same thing, and of course, we're going to keep getting the same results. Do we want to continue to treat this as the problem of a dictatorship, or are we going to begin to change our view of what's happening in Venezuela as the actions of an armed criminal group that took over a country and has the country hostage? Excuse me, we can't continue, but we're going to change the strategy. I think that more or less we've got the idea. Change the strategy from working with the government to that of working with the criminal gang. I'm a master's student in Georgetown from Mexico. I have a question about the lack of credibility, the young people's belief in politics and the system, and unwillingness to get involved in all of this. I'd just like to say something that weren't told. What would you recommend? What would your words of encouragement be for those young people who still want to get involved in the system and somehow and in politics? And I think that this is a way to change things in our countries. Thank you. Let's go to Denise for that question and then try to wrap things up. And excuse me for the shortage of time. The biggest political changes in Mexico, as I was saying, are not coming from the establishment, as I said. They're coming from civil society. And in Mexico, for example, I see the political position of someone like Pedro Amut, an independent member of Congress who now wants to become a senator. And he went through Ruta Ciudadana by collecting signatures on petitions and without having ties to any party. And because of this, he has a lot of freedom. And I think that that is the path to follow, because within the traditional political parties, I don't see any capacity for rebirth. It's going to come from the outside. I know that independent candidates in Latin America, because of the way they've behaved in some countries, have generated great ambivalence. In Mexico, it's clear that they are not the panacea. They're going to not going to cure cancer, but they are a way to revitalize out-of-date parties that don't attract young people. Yes, Luis Vicente, I completely agree that one of the worst things that happened to the Venezuelan people is both a political and economic model that concentrated power and the economy, and it became very relevant. It affected freedoms and democracy. So I fully agree that we have paid a tremendous cost for this over almost 20 years, and it keeps getting worse, and it's probably going to get even worse again. So this is an issue that's there, and the economy isn't destroyed by any sanctions. The economy is destroyed by a model that doesn't work and which has affected our productive capacity. That's very clear. There's no debate about it. So I think that sanctions do make it worse because that is occurring, and furthermore now, sanctions complicate the situation. They complicate people's ability to move. It doesn't just affect one person or the visa of one government official, but they affect trade. They affect the economic sanctions have an impact. So I have to be very careful to make sure that they are laser focused, and they can complicate things even more in the future. These complications are what I was referring to. It's not that now you're going to have an economy that's more or less bad, but now you have an economy that's a little bit worse, plus there's somebody responsible for it in the mind of the population, which is added to Maduro. So you're not winning anything, but rather losing in political terms. But what I'm getting at is that these sanctions, as proposed, have not resolved problems anywhere. The only sanctions that have been successful in the world have been multilateral ones and not unilateral ones, as well as sanctions that can be reversed. They have to be reversible. Why? It has to be something that you lay on the table to as a negotiating tool. If you propose a list of terrorists as sanctions, you can't get involved in that, or you can't use that for drug traffickers. Sanctions that work are those that can be negotiated and brought to the negotiating table because they pressure the other party to give ground to bring about change. That's what worked in Iran and other places. But these kinds of sanctions, it has been proved through experience in the world to not work. And going back to another of the questions, this is a question that I've always heard some 20,000 times, not just in these types of meetings, but also at home every day with my wife. She says, how can you negotiate with criminals and people who abuse us? You can't negotiate with these people. So probably the Chilean people could explain things to us a lot better because they did have political negotiations with these kind of people. And the Colombians did as well, and who they had to negotiate with. One thing is essential. You do not negotiate politics with your buddies. You negotiate with the bad guys, or the people that you think are the bad guys, or with your enemies, if you will. So you negotiate with who you have to negotiate with. And here we're going to have to negotiate with the other party who may have something to give up to strike a balance. I don't choose who the counterpart is. I might negotiate, and look where we are. So I simply, when I discuss this with my wife, for example, in Venezuela, in Caracas, it's a very dangerous city where you could get kidnapped at any time. It may be a light kidnapping or a tough kidnapping. I've taken away my wife's cell phone because I don't want that to be used. I don't want to hear from them. I don't want somebody else to negotiate instead of her. We don't negotiate on fundamental rights. Marta, I'd like to end on a positive note for 30 seconds. I think that the question that you asked is essential, and I think that you do see some possible paths in Mexico and Chile. You see young people who are trying to form new parties. They're trying to be angels, to leave the devil in the past. That's what's happening. There's tremendous demand in the region for better democracy. And that is really very good news. What's happening in Venezuela is very good news because people want to get rid of Maduro. They will not accept dictatorship or bad politics. This is good because they're rejecting the bad. So there are some encouraging signs out there. So we people aren't just arguing about this at home, but rather in the town square. So we do see some lights.
On that, and I'm sorry we're going to have to close it, but there are a lot of people that want to, but we have to go to our final session. But just to build off that, the dialogue has had the series of books, Constructing Democratic Governance in Latin America. Denise wrote a great chapter for us on Mexico, and we've had several others. The last volume that came out a year or so ago, we had a chapter on Peru called Democracy Without Parties. And I'm just wondering, listening to all of these presentations, whether we should do the whole volume called Democracy Without Political Parties. That maybe the future of many countries in Latin America, we should look at Peru. I mean, I lived in Peru when Fujimori was elected in 1990, and it's been 27 years ago, and everybody's been talking about reconstructing and reforming and renewing political parties. And here we are with Kuczynski and Fujimori, and there's nothing. And yet Peru is Peru. It's a great place, and it works and functions, and the economy is growing, and they eat better than any other country in Latin America. And Mexico, okay. I knew I'd get in trouble with the Mexico. I know Sado Khan and Lázaro will give me a hard time. But anyway, and I just listening to Denise, listening to Rodrigo, I just wonder whether, we're going to have democracy without parties. And that's the Peru we see today is going to be the future for some other countries in Latin America. Anyway, I want to thank João, Denise, Marta, Luis Vicente, Rodrigo. These are fantastic presentations. We could have gone much longer. Thank everybody. I'm very sorry we had to cut it off, but please join me.